All right, can you see that all right? A couple short circuits at the beginning. All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation today, Natalie and Christine. And I'm pleased to share the stage a bit with Teja. We have not encountered each other before in person, so this will have to do. So my job today is to connect field crops entomology to IPPM. And really what this is going to end up being is an argument for avoiding preventative pesticides. But just to start, and I know you guys have probably touched upon this, I haven't participated in every presentation that you've had, but integrated pest management was kind of first introduced back in 1959 as the integrated control concept by a group of entomologists at University of California, Riverside. And this was a project that was started in alfalfa and was meant to kind of eliminate calendar sprays. If you eliminate calendar sprays, then you can avoid problems from resistance, insecticide residues on food, pollution, and non-target effects. But one of the key features of this was that insecticides were supposed to be the final resort. So they're kind of like the last option. So if everything else doesn't work, then we use insecticides. And one of the key points highlighted in the original papers on this was that if we do this, then natural enemies should be able to provide pest control, or at least a large portion of the pest control. And if they fail, then we have insecticides as a backup. So I trust you guys all know that. Just wanted to review that to make sure we're on the same page. In Pennsylvania, where I do research and where Penn State is, we have a good opportunity for natural enemies to provide pest control. Because of a lot of our state, the agricultural landscape is confined to these valleys. So it's not that far that natural enemies need to try to move to colonize agricultural fields. All the forest around should be good source population. And these hedgerows and lines of trees and little woodlots kind of extend oftentimes close to fields. So it should be good source population for natural enemies, which is great, a good place to be. On top of that, only 14% of Pennsylvania is covered with crops. And most of those crops are down in the southeastern part of the state. Where we do our research in central Pennsylvania is up here, and we're in this called the Ridge and Valley system. So that valley I just showed you is very typical. We can compare this to Midwestern states where the percentage of crops covering that state is much, much higher. For example, in Iowa, 86% of Iowa is covered by corn and soybeans. That's a huge number. In Illinois, for example, it's 75%. So I consider myself lucky to be able to research in Pennsylvania where it's only 14. So we have a whole lot more natural resources to draw on. Another detail that is important for Pennsylvania is that Pennsylvania is largely dominated by no-till. So that is about 75% of our large acreage crops like soybeans or corn are managed without tillage. So these fields never see a plow. And that equates to about 420,000 hectares of land in Pennsylvania isn't plowed on an annual basis. And that's great. So avoiding tillage provides clear benefits. Some of those benefits are just practical in that you don't need to be in a tractor as long because you don't need to drive across the field as much. Doing that means you can decrease the amount of fuel you use. But importantly, from an environmental perspective, it conserves soil because it doesn't erode as much and it holds water better. So no-till fields better absorb water, and then it kind of holds on to it longer. So there's clear farming benefits to moving to no-till. But from an entomological perspective, no-till fields increase natural enemy populations. So natural enemy populations can be more abundant in no-till fields compared to fields that regularly see tillage. And that's a key feature to keep in mind. Unfortunately, large-scale agriculture doesn't really benefit from this. So this is just a screenshot from a Google Maps image of central Illinois, which is corn and soybeans as far as you can see. And there's very little natural habitat you can see around. There are these kind of riparian corridors, but there's not many trees around. And these habitats, farmers have largely moved away from IPM. And it's not the farmers really, it's agricultural industry hasn't provided much of an opportunity for IPM to fit in. In these habitats, insecticides are used. Insecticides are actually overused, and they've been overused since they were first introduced. back in 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and there was a large backlash about concern of overuse of insecticides. But unfortunately, even publication of this seminal book hasn't really changed a whole lot, because insecticide use continues to increase. It continued to increase after Silent Spring, and it continues to increase today. So in field crops, and in Pennsylvania, I'm talking about corn, soybeans, alfalfa, wheat, barley, rye, those type of crops. Very little insecticide is deployed via IPM. Rather, they're being used as insurance treatments. And these insurance treatments of insecticides are used because they're simpler, they make farming easier, but they also decrease good insects. They can exacerbate pest problems, and they can cause all sorts of environmental problems. But this is the kind of the current state of affairs. And if you don't believe me that insecticide use is going up with time, here are a couple maps from the US Geological Survey. This shows the active ingredient called lambda-cyhalothrin, which is a pyrethroid. This is how much was used in the United States in 92. That's 97, that's 2007. We don't yet have the map for 2017. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. We do have the map for 2017. So you can just see it's going up and up. And if we attribute this to various different types of crops, you can see the estimated use on the vertical axis over time. And I didn't provide the legend here, but green is soybeans, yellow is corn, brown is wheat, and red is cotton. But anyway, it's continuing to go up over time. So it's quite clear that this is a very well-used insecticide. And we can do the same thing for the neonicotinoid insecticides. Here's clothianidin, which is most often coated on corn seedlings, or maize seeds, I should say. And that's the amount used. So this is the amount used in 2003, that's 2011, and that's 2014. So it's quite clear that use of these compounds is escalating, and this is contributing to toxic landscapes, as our host Christina Grosinger and her former postdoc Maggie Douglas have published on. And this map just shows the change in oral toxic load due to these insecticides on the landscape. And of course, it's greatest in central Illinois and in Iowa, and kind of that heartland of the United States where most of these crops are grown. But there are these little spatterings of color over in Pennsylvania. Remarkably, though, from these neonicotinoid insecticides in Pennsylvania, we see very little benefit in terms of yield productivity. So here on the vertical axis, we have yield in bushels per acre, rather than your metric units, but that's what we use for talk with our farmers. And we have where we have no insecticide on the seed, and where we have the seed coat, and the same thing for corn. And we just see no benefits to using these things, which is another unfortunate detail of this scenario. But of course, in Pennsylvania, we get pests that colonize our no-till fields, even though we have better natural enemy populations. And the most notorious of those are slugs. So slugs, of course, are not insects. They're mollusks, and they can feed on whatever they want. They're generalists, and they can be very abundant. To show how abundant they can be, this is the front of a hay mower. So this farmer was mowing his hay field, which was a mixed grass and hay field. He was mowing his field in the evening in the spring a couple of years ago. And these are all slugs on the front of that hay mower. So we can have pretty good slug populations. This farmer didn't quite understand why his hay field wasn't yielding well. And he went out there at night, and he found out why. Too many slugs. So that's a good abundance of slugs. And slugs are voracious feeders. They eat on kind of whatever they want. So they can be particularly hard on soybeans, feeding on the cotyledons when the plants are really young and vulnerable. This seedling on the right is dead because the cotyledons have been fed off. This is a soybean field from the southeastern part of Pennsylvania that has been replanted 3 times. So after 3 times of planting with soybean seed, you still see these large gaps, and this is just unacceptable to a grower. So these guys are looking for help. So slugs can damage virtually any crop that we grow, whether it's canola, soybeans, corn or maize, alfalfa, and also all the small grains, whether it's wheat, rye, barley. So a couple of years ago, I had a graduate student named Maggie Douglas, who is the same Maggie Douglas that was a postdoc with Christina. But her PhD thesis kind of asked the question, if slugs are the main pests in our crop fields, what effect do insecticides have? And the fact is that neonicotinoid seed treatments seem to exacerbate slug populations. So here on the vertical axis, we have the number of slugs per trap. To trap slugs, we just use little pieces of shingles, which are typically on the roofs of houses, but we cut them up and put them in the crop fields. And this is just the growing season. And these data are from corn or maize. And the red line is where we have our seedlings established with neonicotinoid seed treatments. And the blue line is an untreated seeds. And you can see on average over the course of the growing season, we have more slugs compared in those plots that had the neonicotinoid seed treatment compared to where we don't. And in the paper that Rachel shared with the class, Maggie detailed this this phenomenon for soybeans. So these data are soybeans. The previous were for corn. We have kind of the same story in both. We just haven't gotten around to publishing the corn piece. But here on the vertical axis, we have number of soybean plants per hectare. This is the number of slugs per trap. And you can see the more slugs we have, the fewer soybean plants we get. But the slugs are more damaging where we have the neonicotinoids coated on seeds, these black dots, compared to where we don't. And Maggie also did a wonderful job connecting these slug populations to predators. So we know that predators can control slug populations. So in this figure, we have predation on the vertical axis, and predation is measured by sentinel prey. So we put out caterpillars in the field and we wait for them to be eaten. And so the higher the number, the better. And the horizontal axis is number of slug predators in our pitfall traps. So as the slug predators go up, predation goes up, which is great, but we have fewer slug predators and less predation where we have the insecticide coated on the seed. So these black dots. And we can relate this, this predation to slugs. So these are the number of slugs in traps next to where we did the predation assay in the field. And as predation goes up, the number of slugs per trap comes down, but still where we have the insecticide coated on the seed, we have less predation and more slugs, which is the opposite of what a farmer wants to see if he's paying money for a pest control product. So what we have here is an example of the insecticides disrupting biological control. But the unique feature here is that the insecticide isn't going directly from the plants to the predators. It's actually going through the slug. So as you probably saw, if you read those papers, we actually measured the amount of insecticides in slugs, and it's high enough to kill individual ground beetles that might come along. And in a follow-up work, we started to ask questions about how these insecticides are influencing decomposition in fields. So this is work done by a recent graduate of Penn State named Kirsten Pearsons. And Kirsten did a lot of decomposition work. So she put bags of various meshes out into the field and had residue in those bags and just tracked how quickly it broke down, a typical decomposition study. And this figure from her paper that you also had sent to you is that the percent litter remaining with the total amount of arthropods that were found in these bags. And it's not surprisingly, there's a nice relationship. So the more arthropods in the bag, the faster the residue in the bags broke down. But when we used insecticides, whether it was that lambda-cyhalothrin or a neonicotinoid seed treatments, these various groups of decomposers were reduced, some dramatically so. So there are fewer millipedes, fewer insects in the bags, fewer collembolans, fewer mites, and the influence changed depending on which insecticide was present. And this presence or absence of these decomposers changes the rate at which this decomposition occurs. So these figures show different time points in Kirsten's experiment, starting in panel A, that was the spring of 2016, and panel E is the spring of 2018. And as time went on, decomposition was always slower, or if there was a difference, decomposition was always slower when the insecticides were present. And by the end of the 3-year experiment, we had a 10% difference between the decomposition rate of plots where insecticides were used compared to where they weren't. Right, so that's significant because these insecticides are decreasing these invertebrate decomposers, but also may be significant for slugs, because if there's more residue around, slugs can be more comfortable for a longer period of time because they hide underneath the residue. So it could be that there's a weird feedback mechanism happening here where insecticides are making slugs more comfortable because the residue sticks around longer and they don't have as many predators trying to eat them. So I'm going to return to the idea of these no-till fields. So we can take advantage of this if we just try to use a little IPM. So no-till makes conservation possible because it fosters natural enemy populations. We have better natural enemy populations when we use no-till compared to tillage, as I said earlier, and that is across a range of different types of predator groups, whether it's ground beetles, carabids, or staphylinids, firefly larvae, these lampyrids, ants, spider, harvestmen, and so on. And if we actually use IPM rather than blindly using insecticides, we can actually take advantage of these guys. And we've been doing that in this project, which has been going on for 10 years. It's called the Penn State Diversified Dairy Cropping Systems Project. And the goal of this project is to grow everything a dairy farm would need in their fields. And we're doing this with these diverse 6-year rotations that include cover crops. They can include alfalfa, they can include small grains, and we're comparing them to a simple corn soybean rotation, which is kind of the standard in Pennsylvania and surrounding states. From an insect and slug management perspective, we're treating these rotations quite differently. The simple rotation has a higher input, so we're using BT corn, we're using seed treatments, and we're using a broadcast spray of pyrethroid shortly after planting, which is a typical practice done by farmers in the area. And we're comparing that to IPM, where we're actually going out and scouting these fields. We're not using transgenic corn, we're not using seed treatments, we're only using insecticides if pests exceed an economic threshold. Without going into all the gory details, the pests have been worse in this simplified rotation, in part because there are fewer natural enemies. And those natural enemy data are showed here. Here on the vertical axis, we have the number of slug predators per trap per day. And these are ground beetles, wolf spiders, rove beetles, and the like. Over the two treatments, we have the high input treatment, which is the typical corn soybean rotation. And then we have the low input treatment, which is our more diversified rotations. And you can see, and each panel is a year. So after year 4, you start to get a separation between the abundance of predators in these two rotations. This is the 6th year of the project. We are now in year 10, and we're continuing to see this separation after 10 years. And this matters for the amount of damage occurring on the crop plants in the fields. This figure shows the slug damage in terms of the proportion of plants receiving damage. And that correlates strongly and negatively with the number of predators per trap. So the more predators we have, the less slug damage we're seeing. So these predators can make quite a difference against something like slugs, which are really hard to control. So no-till makes conservation possible. But then if we add cover crops on top of that, it can make this situation even better. A recent set of studies that we've done have shown that by fostering this simple food web, which no-till and then cover crops kind of add to, we can really reduce our pest problem. So this is a figure that's showing white grubs. So the vertical axis is the number of white grubs per area. And so white grubs are a pest that'll feed on corn and soybean roots. And the horizontal axis is the amount of cover crop biomass in those fields. So the more cover crop biomass we have, the fewer white grubs we have. Okay, nice negative relationship there. And we find the same negative relationship with slugs. So the more biomass we have on the field before planting, the less slug damage we have to those adjacent plants. So cover crops can even add to this no-till system. And importantly, we have farmers in Pennsylvania that are keen on this idea. So I interact with these with gentlemen that are part of this Pennsylvania No-Till Alliance, and they are farmers trying to improve soil health. But our research and kind of my interactions with them, my students' interactions with them, have convinced them that IPM really matters. So by taking insecticides out of the field, we can protect natural enemies, we can improve soil quality, And they really believe in soil health. So they're not tilling. They have diverse rotations with cover crops. And this is the important piece that they've added, is that they only use insecticides when necessary. And they've had good success with this. And so this is one of the farmers that accompanies me to some of my field days. So if I have a field day talking to some clientele in Pennsylvania, having one of these farmers along with me is a huge asset, because it adds a level of credibility that I don't have because I'm just an academic, not a farmer. And they're doing really progressive things. Like this is a farmer planting corn into a standing crimson clover cover crop. So they're really pushing the envelope, but this type of system will only work when IPM is used. So just to wrap up here, so I want to emphasize that the no-till acreage that we have in Pennsylvania really makes conservation possible, because those no-till fields have more natural enemies. And if we add cover crops on top of that, then we just enhance the habitat, and the populations of natural enemies are increased even more. So IPM has a place in field crop production, particularly in a place with like Pennsylvania, where slugs are a big challenge, and slugs are difficult to control with commercial molluscicides, and they're certainly not controlled with insecticides. And it is the case that the agricultural industry isn't helping, because they're really pushing insecticides on most acres. And if slugs are our main pest, then that insecticide is only harming and it's not helping. From a bigger picture perspective, we know that the insecticide use that's occurring out there is excessive, and it's inconsistent with the risk being posed by these animals. It's only being used as an insurance policy, and sometimes this insurance fails. And it's causing non-target effects in the predator communities and the decomposer communities. But it's also the case that the effects are felt beyond the fields. As you guys have been discussing in this course, it extends to pollinators and other animals we're interested in conserving. So no-till provides this space for conservation, but it has to be paired with IPM, because regular insecticide use kind of disrupts some of these benefits of conservation agriculture. But we found that if you can find the group of progressive farmers that really believe that a different way has to be a better way, they will embrace IPM if you show them the benefits. And we've showed them some of the benefits, and this group of farmers really has embraced it really well. But the increased adoption of IPM is only going to benefit kind of the larger toxicology of the landscape, because we have more people using IPM, that will be less insecticides on the landscape, and that'll help reduce this kind of larger risk. So I strongly believe that the risks posed by neonicotinoids have more to do with the amount of acreage being planted with them every year than the actual compounds themselves. If we just use them on a smaller acreage, perhaps their use could be sustainable, but in the current usage patterns, is certainly not the case. All right, so that's mostly what I had to share today. I'm happy to hang out with you guys for the next hour to listen to Teja and then answer some questions after the end. Is that right, Natalie?
That sounds great. So in the interest of time, we're just going to go ahead and let Teja go and give his presentation. And we do have some questions coming in, but we'll just hold those off until the end of both of these seminars. Thank you.
Oh, does it work so far? Oh,
looks great.
So now it's fine.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. I think I'm also talking about large crop monocultures, but partly in a very different direction, as John did in his most interesting talk, focusing also much on insecticide use, etc., and these slug problems, which were very interesting. Here, it's more my talk. It's more about conservation in landscapes dominated by large crop monocultures. And as you all know, to make a start with a broader picture. You know, we live in the UN decade on biodiversity, or we left it right now, and now are in the decade on ecosystem restoration. So halting the dramatic losses in biodiversity is a major point. There were lots of national and international biodiversity strategies which failed. As you know, there's a still consistently declining biodiversity notice. But on the other hand, of course, for a sustainable future, you have to think of also other pieces, also very important factors. First, that global food demand will double until 2050 because of the population increase, and last but not least because of the violated planetary boundaries. A good life for all will mean that we in the north have to cut our ecological footprint very much. If everybody on the world would live like a US citizen, we would need 5 planets, and as a Germany would still need 3 planets. So first of all, we need to get rid of our consumption. I think this is something what we all need to keep in mind. So when you think of agricultural landscapes, especially also in our Central European situation, there is an obvious scale mismatch. People and farmers and people always think on the plant and field level, but patterns look very different when you also include the landscape level. And as you all know, on the landscape level, there's a species pool which drives the pattern which you find on the field level. So key drivers of interactions and also of biodiversity are found on the landscape level, on the landscape structure, not on the field level, which is often not respected, also not by politicians, and for example, also not by the EU policy. We studied these since many years. We have around our city, we selected landscapes dominated by annual crops, mainly cereals, which are here in yellow, and we have other landscapes nearby which are fairly diverse. So maybe it's not so disconnected, very colorful landscapes and very monoculture dominated landscape as it is in the US. So you have everything close by, and so you have this landscape where up to the horizon you have only arable fields, but you have also these landscape rich with field margins, with hedgerows, forest edges and fallows and whatsoever. And species respond to these landscape at different spatial scales in different direction. Martin Schmidt, in his PhD, he studied spiders, arable spiders in winter wheat. So the idea is always to check the abundance of these species in the center, and then to analyze whether the immediate surroundings or the further away surroundings influence this abundance. For example, let's say when you think of bees, solitary bees may use only the direct environment, whereas bumblebees, large bumblebees or honeybees use the whole larger area. So this can be also shown that this is the main driver. And what he found is that there is positive response of many spiders to landscape complexity, so to the amount of natural habitat in the landscape, as shown here for the most abundant spiders, but it's also on very different scales. And you have also a number of spiders which respond negatively to landscape complexity, meaning that their abundance is the highest in landscapes dominated by monocultures. So you have a species-specific response, and here these are all, what is shown is they are all significant effects, with the black points give the most significant ones. So showing that landscape structure really matters for what you find locally. And of course, the species pool hypothesis that a regional species pool dominates local species has been shown before. We did this already in the beginning of the 2000s. You see, we established flower pots, flowering plants, which are flowering across the season in different landscapes made up by different amount of natural habitat. And when you have more natural habitat, you have at least twice the number of solitary bee species and overall bee species as it's shown here. So the landscape, we have the same local situation, a strip, a field margin strip along a cereal field, but a very different composition of the landscape. And this has a major determining effect here on richness. The same is also true for reserves that we have. We have often very small reserves in Germany, like these calcareous grasslands showing here. The most biodiverse habitats, what we find, but surrounded by agriculture-dominated landscapes. And here's a study by Urs Kormann and Verena Rösch for many taxa, considered plants by butterflies, as you can see, spiders, rove beetles, grasshoppers, etc. And what they found is that the more arable land you have in the surrounding landscape, the less species you have on these calcareous grasslands. This does not only apply for very general species, generalists, but also for specialist species. So you lose almost 30% if the landscape around these calcareous grasslands are made up by annual crops. Complex landscape also are known from many reviews and meta-analyses to enhance biological control, as John already also mentioned. So landscape with a lot of semi-natural habitat, they enhance natural enemy diversity, they reduce pest densities in general, but not always. There are only always also many pests around, which are where the antagonists, the biocontrol agents are not promoted, not enhanced by natural areas. It has been nicely shown for aphids, cereal aphids, with 10 systems with exclusion experiments and landscape gradients, that you have less aphids in the simplified landscape. So in this case, for cereal aphids, at least here in Europe, there is much evidence that this landscape structure plays a major role for aphid control. The same is true also for crop pollination. We studied cherry orchards, sweet cherry orchards in our surroundings, and found that twice of semi-natural habitats in the landscape means 3 times tripling wild bee densities, and you have a double crop yield in the end, which is shown here. Wild bee visitation rates and fruit set is shown here. It's not only fruit sets, but which is not shown here, but also final yield, which is following this line on a lower level. And you have these high diversity bee habitats in fruit set, etc. And it's also shown by hand pollination that pollination limitation is the reason. Interestingly, this effect has been made by wild bees only, although honeybees are very common, but they did not significantly explain the differences in yield in the end. So I come to the question, which is coming, of course, when you have landscapes with a lot of semi-natural habitat, you lose a lot of area for crops or for production. So we followed an approach here with Annika Haas, whether you can increase the landscape heterogeneity with crops and what role this may play. So when you have your landscape here and you have your natural habitat here, you may increase the semi-natural habitat, here shown in this case, to enhance heterogeneity in the species pool and the overall conservation value of your landscape. But you can also keep this small part of semi-natural habitat, but increase the farmland heterogeneity, so make the fields smaller and cultivate more different crops. And this is what we did in the project across Europe. So we have on the one hand the so-called farmland compositional heterogeneity. So you have a more diverse composition of crops. And here on the x-axis you have the farmland configurational heterogeneity, meaning that the fields are smaller and you have much longer field borders in your landscapes, here shown with digitized landscapes that we considered. And what Annika found is that especially configurational heterogeneity plays a huge role for bee abundance and also seed sets. He also studied seed sets. And she found here, for example, across these different countries, when you have long field borders, you can have up to 10 times or 5 to 10 times more bees in your landscapes. So independent of semi-natural habitat, just having more edges in your landscapes, also only the edges on the one hand, plus the field margin, the boundary, small boundary habitats, but also the edges in itself play a big role, enhance significantly these local bee abundance. And as you may know, landscape, for landscape and for populations surviving in landscape, dispersal and connectivity plays a big role. This has been already shown by this classical Levin's metapopulation model, which is determined only by the extinction rate and the colonization rate, which means when you have no colonization locally, extinction is the force dominating everything. And even you can have a national park as big as you want. When you have no colonization, then it's only a matter of time that you would lose species by extinction because of environmental fluctuations, etc. Andrea also showed with that these small field margin strips, which are very common in our landscapes along these cereal fields, can have an impact, for example, for predatory wasps, having large natural populations on the forest margin, but then spilling over into the center of these arable landscapes, which is interesting. Also, living fences for hummingbirds in the tropics have shown for that. And as I said before, simply crop edges are obviously important orientation marks for bumblebees in enhancing colonization. For these 8 regions in Europe and Canada with 435 fields, the overall analysis by Clelia showed that mean field size and corresponding field border lengths plays a big role for biodiversity. And there are particularly steep increases when you decrease your field size below 6 hectares. Of course, I think in the States you have much larger fields, crop fields, than we have in general. But here you gain a lot without increasing natural habitats. It's simply the permeability of the fields which play here a role. So when you have a mean field site reduction from 6 hectares to 1 hectare, you have 6 times more species. And another calculation from 5 hectares to 2.8 hectares, this corresponds to habitat increase, natural habitat increase from up to 10 or 11%. This compositional heterogeneity, so that you have more crop species, also plays a role for cereal aphids decrease control, which is lower with higher crop densities, but only when under certain conditions, let's say. And the configurational heterogeneity for aphid control plays a bigger role, and also for aphid parasitism, as shown by Aliet. In another study, I think was also sent around by Annika, she showed, and this is also very typical here, that you have this compositional heterogeneity is of limited importance because we have so few crops in our landscapes. We have only, and so you can have a big range of crops so that in the end crop identity effects are dominating. What she found is that increasing maize cover, and maize has been subsidized for biogas production, for energy use, that maize cover means when you have more maize that you have a reduced pollen diversity, and that this makes up because that pollen diversity is a major predictor of the maximum weight of bumblebee colonies. She exposed bumblebee colonies in these landscapes and found that maize is a major predictor of the performance. In another study in the same direction, which was even before this EU farmland project, Peter Batari studied the situation along the former Iron Curtain between East and West Germany. In the Eastern Germany, in former Eastern Germany, there was this collectivization of farms, and you have much bigger farms and much bigger fields, and this is still the case than in West Germany. So along this border, the former border, in West Germany, you have these small fields, and in the East, you have these very large fields. On average, 20-hectare fields, and in West Germany, small farms with on average 3-hectare fields. When we compared these situations, so you have much longer field edges in the West compared to the East. The yield per hectare is identical in these large fields. It's about winter wheat that was the focus. Organic and conventional winter wheat yield per hectare is identical, but in organic around half of the productivity than in conventional ones. The profit for the farmer is with large fields 50% higher. This is of course in these currently the reason, of course, because that farmers are increasing field size all the time because it saves labor and costs. And although organic cereals were only half, or had only half of the productivity of conventional, the profit was higher because of the marketability, the very good marketability in Europe of organic products these days. So, and what he found is that field farm parameter he accumulated on the x-axis and the species richness for several groups. Here on the y-axis for East conventional and East organic farms and West conventional and West organic farms here, that, as you can see here along this line, that when you have a landscape dominated by 3-hectare fields, even the conventional fields are on a higher level in terms of species richness than the large organic fields found in the East. So the field size has a huge effect, which is totally underestimated, I think, so far. So this also raises the question whether the biodiversity crisis in our agricultural landscape means that the organic farming approach is really the overarching solution, which is often suggested. Organic as a win-win-win situation for everybody. I said already that yield is on a small level, and you can also follow this line. You have the certified organic farming strives for sustainability and the enhancement of soil fertility and biodiversity. But it prohibits only synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides and GMOs. But there is an increasing intensification and specialization of organic farming. There are increasingly organic farms with large fields, with large monocultures. Almeria, for example, in southern Spain, crops are grown under plastic, and there is an increasing amount of organic vegetable production under plastic. This has nothing to do with biodiversity promotion, I would say. And then they have this low yield, 20% on average. In cereals, even only half of the yield you found. And what is missing then in organic fields? It's a lot. Diversification of crop rotation, avoiding monocultures, crop and variety mixtures are not automatically part of the organic certification, but very important in terms of enhancement of biodiversity. For example, we started with this kind of strip cropping of large fields, which had already a big effect on biodiversity, what we could show. So, and also the amount of semi-natural habitat. People always think of organic farms as a very rich, family-based, small farm, but this is the past, I would say. Currently, we have these organic farms have often not more semi-natural habitats on their farms than conventional fields, but this makes a difference in terms of biodiversity. So beyond organic certification, push crop diversification, keep natural remnants on your farm, which should also be part of the certification. And of course, have an eye on the landscape structure, augment the species pools with semi-natural habitat, prioritize your management in simple landscapes with intensive land use, because there you can have the biggest effect with introducing, for example, natural habitat remnants. Consider large spatial scales, because we have this turnover from one area to the next. We have very different species compositions, and better diversity is of major importance. Promote landscape-wide cropland heterogeneity, in particular, go for small fields or subsidize small fields because they have such a big effect. And then in the end have look at these land sharing, sparing connectivity landscape in the sense that you have a spillover from spared natural habitat to agroecosystems, so that also beneficials can come in, also from shared field margin strips, for example, in agroecosystem, and the exchange between these small remnants along the fields and larger spared habitats. So to enhance the permeability of the landscape, that species can easily spill over, which has a big rescue effect for these small populations that you usually only find in landscapes. And when it comes to insects, you have a lot of extinctions going on. So recolonization plays a major role. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you so much to John and Teja for their really fascinating lectures on monocrops in Europe and in the US. So we have some questions that have come in, and there are a lot of back and forth between the panelists in the chat that I know many of you haven't been able to see. So let me think about how we want to distill this for a second.
Anyway, two great talks, and Teja, great points you made. So I'm not the only one just saying that landscape is often much more important than conventional farming.
So I don't know. Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt, Alex.
No. Ask questions. There were many good points.
Yeah, so I just, I sense a lot of you weren't able to see this discussion that happened in the background. I just wanted to bring this to the forefront. And I don't know, John, if you feel comfortable sort of summarizing what you mean by no-till and what that means for herbicide applications.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Alex, that was a great question. And one of the downsides of no-till agriculture in Pennsylvania and the United States generally is that it's dependent on herbicides. So this is like a dirty secret of the conservation ag world, is that it wouldn't, the conservation, let me say this again, the conservation that has been achieved so far is almost, it's dependent on glyphosate use. So glyphosate is really good at what it does, and it's less toxic than other options, and it has benefits. But so farming is often it's all about trade-offs, and in my mind, avoiding tillage is more important for conservation than the unfortunate detail that herbicides are necessary to pull off the conservation system. So it would be difficult to do this type of conservation farming that is no-till with cover crops without glyphosate. We have researchers at Penn State that are trying to do that, but it's difficult to get good control of the weeds and the cover crop just by rolling them or by mowing them, and it's a little bit more intensive. And there is clear benefit to the cover crop and weed residue lying on the field because that residue provides habitat. So yes, this conservation farming is dependent on an input of an herbicide.
And it works only, sorry to interrupt directly, and it also works only with genetically modified crops, which is a no-go in Europe, or at least in Germany these days. So this makes it also very complicated, let's say, in our situation.
So I would disagree slightly because the glyphosate, the most important glyphosate use is before planting. So you could pull off this type of system without glyphosate, without using glyphosate during the growing year, I'm sorry, after planting. So yeah, so the most conservation benefit comes from the glyphosate that's being used before the crop's established. So you could, yeah, and I work with farmers that don't use genetically modified crops. They just have a different herbicide program. But it should be acknowledged that those herbicides that they're using might be less environmentally friendly than glyphosate. So there's this contradiction and trade-off.
Which herbicides are more friendly, environmental friendly than glyphosate? I'm just asking because it's a big discussion at the moment in Germany and Europe anyway. So.
I meant to say the opposite.
Okay.
Less
okay.
environmentally
then
friendly.
Yeah. And one question. So in former times, in the Middle Ages, we also used tillage. And we still have farmers, they use tillage and not glyphosate, and they have biodiversity. So I wonder if we can use different methods of tillage. You said partly tillage is not something you do in the US, but do you think this would be an option not to till very deep in the soil, but just the upper soil or something like that?
Right, fair questions. And just to address the first thing you said, the challenge we have with tillage isn't that tillage is happening, it's the scale of the tillage. So when you have the whole state of Iowa, or 2/3 of Iowa being tilled every year, that's not good for soil erosion. And it's not good for water retention. It's not good for a lot of things. But yes, there are different types of tillage. The type of tillage that is most popular, the tillage system in Pennsylvania that's most popular is no-till. So that's completely avoiding tillage. There are reduced tillage options, but those aren't kind of credited the same way by state and federal governments because they don't do as good of a job avoiding erosion. The main reason that people avoid tillage is to avoid erosion. So we're trying to keep the soil where it's meant to be because that will help farmers farm, but it'll also avoid the sedimentation that comes when water carries that sediment to the nearby stream and it gets to a river and it gets to the Chesapeake Bay. So all the no-till promotion that has occurred in the mid-Atlantic states, that would include Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia to a small degree, New Jersey and Delaware, is all because of the health of the Chesapeake Bay. I think that's really interesting because the goals were not meant to augment IPM and to improve kind of the potential for natural enemies to participate in farming. But it's a nice side effect that we should be able to take advantage of. But the detail of tillage is solely driven by erosion. So people do try forms of reduced tillage, things such as strip tillage or a minimal tillage, other factors like that, but they still disturb soil and they still leave the soil exposed to runoff. So the form of tillage, the tillage system that's most appropriate for avoiding erosion is complete no-till. So that's what most farmers in Pennsylvania are doing. They used to get paid for it. There was an incentive to adopt it, but a lot of those incentives have subsided. But people like it because now they have the equipment to farm in it, and it can be more productive and less prone to drought problems. That makes sense? I don't know if I addressed everything that you asked, Alex, but I did my best, and sometimes my best is not good enough.
In Germany, I think, as Alex already partly mentioned, I think no-till is not so common because farmers and the public is very much afraid of glyphosate spraying. So these applying these toxins, let's say, on the field is a much bigger issue than conservation. And so only in this situation, as you said, where soil erosion, so when we have when the topography of the farm goes in this direction, then they have no-till. But it's not very common. And of course, we have no genetically modified crops, so avoid as much as possible glyphosate. There's even the discussion to ban glyphosate in the near future, as you may know. So this is difficult.
I couldn't agree more. I've spent some time in France, and just walking around agricultural towns, you see postings for banning glyphosate. You see postings against banning glyphosate, often with the just a lot of emotion behind some of these postings, you know, skulls and crossbones and that type of thing. But I think those conversations should be people in those conversations should be open to the conservation benefits of using glyphosate. Now, glyphosate isn't the best, but not tilling and keeping soil where it is clearly has benefits. So it just kind of facilitates this type of farming. And until another chemical comes along that could be used similarly, or there's better ways to terminate cover crops and weeds, it's going to be a part of the American system for a long time to come.
I think we're going to need to end there so we can get on to our discussion. And I think that this is actually a really great transition for the questions that we will be asking you all in the discussion section. So with that, I think we're going to close out for this seminar. This was the final seminar of the IPPM series, co-hosted by the University of Freiburg and Penn State University. If you are interested in seeing some of the archived and recorded lectures, they are available on the PSU IBC website. You can also view them through YouTube, which is hosting all of the material. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and shoot us an email. So thank you so much. And for those of you in the class, we'll see you again in just a couple of minutes.